Yes, let's go. All right, we're in Nehemiah. We got one more week to go. And oh, by the way, we won't meet next Wednesday because
You're having
Thanksgiving. That's right. And my daughter announced that we were having Thanksgiving on Wednesday because the boyfriend has reserved Thanksgiving for the day God intended Thanksgiving to be celebrated. So we will not be doing that. Yes, no. I'm an open person. And all my feelings I express. I don't repress anything. So, if I say it, I must mean it.
Things change.
They
What's
do
that?
change.
Things change.
Yeah, we were talking about that.
Yeah, it's not easy.
But it's fine.
But the turkey's usually the same.
And everything we do would be the same. We're just going to move it over a day.
You need gravy
Yeah.
and noodles.
So anyway, we won't meet. We'll finish, but we only got one more week. And in a way, that it works out pretty well, I think, because we'll finish this up, and then I'd like to start Luke. What we'll do is we'll continue the narrative, which I think is kind of neat, because we started it in Genesis, went all the way through the narrative in the Old Testament. Now, we didn't hit particular stories like Ruth and Esther, but they really aren't part of that historical narrative. We didn't look at the prophets or the laws or the Psalms or the Proverbs, but they're sort of in the narrative, but they're not part of the narrative. And the reason I think it works out really well is we'll be looking at Luke 1 and 2 right before Christmas. So, how could it work better than that? Geez Louise. So, anyway, that's what we'll do. And then we can carry that through Acts, which really takes the narrative to the end. So by the time we finish Acts, we will have done the entire biblical narrative from start to finish.
Asked me to describe what the biblical narrative was in simple terms. I'm not sure that I really understand that. I've heard you talk about the narrative and the fact that we've done it. What is a quick way to describe the narrative?
I think the biblical narrative is the story of God and his people. That's what the biblical narrative is. And I can't even add anything to it. Although I'm tempted, because that's the kind of guy I am, to make things really simple, complicated. But yeah, it's the story of God and his people. There's a really, really good book. It was written like 25 years ago on the Old Testament. And the title of the book, and you may run into it sometime, is, now I've lost the title. In the subtitle, I think it says A Biography of God. I think it may be the Bible, a biography of God. And that's what the writer sees the Bible as. It's really God's biography. Now, I think it's not just God, but us. So it's how God has worked with his people. Now, what makes the narrative different than the prophets, because that's still God working with his people, and the law and the poetry and Song of Solomon and the Psalms and the wisdom stuff and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job. All of that is God, and certainly the Gospels and the letters. All of this is God working with his people. In the narrative, it's God working with his people in a historical, with quotation mark, context. So we're talking about, and I put it in quotation marks because there's a lot of, especially in Genesis, there's a lot of stories that are in what seems to be a historical narrative, but really are more importantly stories that we look at and glean meaning. They're not isolated. History sometimes can become isolated in one context. These are stories that have life forever. They have application forever, not just to Abraham or not just to Noah, but they have application to us, because in a sense, we are Noah too. We are Adam. That's what Adam means. Adam means human being. The story of Adam is a story of us. It's a story of humanity. And that's how it was written, and that's why the words used are the words used. Sometimes we miss that, and we think of it as a story of a person. And so his story is important, but it may not relate to us. Well, yeah, it does. It's the story of humanity. It's the story of Adam. And Adam means, it's from the Adamah, from the soil. That's what Adam is. That's who we are. We are from the soil. We are dust. That's what we are. They have the breath of, have the spirit, the ruach of God. Therefore we live. And that's the story, I think, of the narrative. Okay? And we're in it. We're really coming to the close of the narrative in the Old Testament, and we really are. There's not a whole lot after this. Now, if you look at Catholic Bibles, there's some differences, because you have books called the Maccabees, which take it further. But in the scripture we use, we don't see that as inspired. We see it as interesting writing and maybe historical, but we don't see it as part of God's word. So the narrative, as we talk about narrative, really ends when Nehemiah ends. Now there's other stuff that happened, but Nehemiah really marks the end of that narrative story. And then we pick it up about 300 years later, with the New Testament. So that's when it kind of picks up. For Christians, now for Jews, they don't see it that way, of course, but for us. Okay, so we've done this narrative to this point. What we've gone through the kings, and we've gone, and as we look at the kings, what tended to be the story of the kings? What seemed to be the writer's point as we were looking at the kings? What seemed to be some themes as we looked at the different kings?
They were wicked.
Yeah, a lot of them were wicked. A lot of them were stinkers. And how were they wicked?
They
worshipped other gods. And that seemed to be a theme. And you have a couple that are good. Some of the good ones are still not great. They still allow some. Some are really good, like Hezekiah and Josiah. But even a lot of the good ones are not great. But some of the bad ones were really, really bad. And what ends up happening in this part of the story? What ends up happening after we have all these stinking kings?
People were exiled, right?
Yeah, the people were exiled. And as the writer presents it, and this is really important, that's why I said it's the story of God and his people. According to the writer or writers, why do the people end up being exiled? And we even see it in what we're looking at today, this same idea. Why, according to the writer of 2 Kings, why are the people of Judah sent into exile?
Because they didn't listen. I don't know.
Okay. They certainly didn't. Why, ultimately, are they sent into exile?
They were taken over.
True. Didn't listen, taken over. Both of you are 100% right. I think there's a reason above that. Above both of those. Both of those are correct. But what is the primary reason, according to the writer, for them being taken into exile? One word. You can say one word.
Sin.
Again, true. One word. Theme from Genesis through Kings.
Disobedience.
True. One word.
Idols.
True. Above.
This is Jeopardy.
God.
God. That's the reason. Everything else you said was right. You were right on the mark. What you said had to do with who? People. Well, everything you listed was why the people, what the people did that caused it. And you were right. Or taking over what other people were doing. But from the writer of the story, it isn't the story of what the people were doing wrong. Ultimately, it was a story of God. This is a story of God. And that's why the return is so important. Because why do the people return? God.
Yeah.
God. Now, we can look historically at the Persians and their philosophy and yada, yada, yada. All of that's true. I'm not saying that's not right. From the perspective of the writer of the story, what he wants his audience to believe after reading his narrative, because he's writing it. I'm saying one person, but there were a lot of people that had their hands in writing this. What he wants his reader to say is, God is driving this story. God is driving this story. And that's the answer. It's sort of like kids in Jesus' time or junior church or whatever. When you ask them a question, the answer is usually Jesus. When in doubt, say Jesus, because odds are that's the right answer. The answer here is
God.
It's God. It's God. And so we've got the people being in exile. And we've got them coming back. Now we went through the book of Ezra, and what was really the point in the book of Ezra? What was going on in Ezra? Because when the people come back, to what do they come back? What are they coming back to?
Ruins.
Oh, they're coming back to ruins. And it's not just physical ruins, right? What else is ruined?
The wall.
The wall is ruined. What else is ruined?
Temple.
The temple is ruined. What else is ruined? Now notice what you're giving me. You're giving me physical things.
Oh, spiritual.
Yes, we've got spiritual. They're ruined spiritually. There is no law to follow. Because there's nowhere to follow it. If you've got to worship in this place, you can't do it. So spiritual, not only are they broken physically, and they certainly are, they are broken spiritually, they're broken politically, they're broken socially. They are a remnant people coming back to this desolated land that's still being occupied by people. So it's not coming into just empty space. So you're dealing with something that's really broken on a lot of levels. And when we look at the book of Ezra and Nehemiah to the point we see both Ezra and Nehemiah doing what? If the people are coming back and they're broken, what do we see Ezra and Nehemiah doing?
Talking to God.
True, talking to God. They're fixing it, right? They're broken people. They're coming. Broken people can't worship. What do you do? If you can't worship, what do? You rebuild the temple, right? You start sacrifices. Where do you do the sacrifices? Where God tells you to do it. So you start recovering physically. You don't have any guidance, boom, you got a law. So we're going to do the worship law. We'll reestablish ourselves spiritually. The wall is down. We can't defend ourselves anymore. What do? Rebuild the wall. Rebuild the wall around the city. And now you can have an identity. Now you're protected. You're not exposed. You're not just part of other nations. You have something that's special. Okay? Now, they still haven't, though, completely. They're still a broken people. And when we looked at the end, what we looked at last week, at the very beginning of chapter 7, the writer tells us in the first 3 verses of chapter 7, even though the wall is done, and they have all this celebration about this new wall that they built, the people are still kind of broken. What does he say right at the beginning of chapter 7? There's no homes. So even though the temple is there, they're doing worship, they got a wall, they can protect themselves, they've overcome opposition, God has been with them every way, they are still broken. They still haven't come to a place where they can say, we are a people here. And that's what we're going to see. That's what we're going to see Nehemiah work with. Now, there's going to be a shift in Nehemiah, which is kind of interesting. Actually, it occurs right when we're starting, although we won't notice it until a little bit later. Now, we've got this established beginning of chapter 7. After it describes this brokenness of the people. You got the wall, but nobody's living in the city. The city's, you don't have homes in the city. What's the first thing Nehemiah does with respect to the population? And this is going to tell us a lot, not only about what's happening here, but what the writer considers important, and really what's going to be important for Judaism, let's see, until now. What does he do? Now that the wall is built, what does Nehemiah do?
Worship.
Well, he does. They have this big worship, verse 3,
He does,
in chapter 7.
Gathers all the people, officials, and they register the families.
Okay, they start enrolling the population. And what is it, what happens that, now, by the way, how does Nehemiah get this idea that we need to have the people listed? We need a census. God put it in his mind. Which the writer, by having that, the writer tells us, is telling us, God's driving this story, and what he's doing is pretty important. This is something that it's not just Nehemiah deciding to do. This is something that God wants Nehemiah to do. He wants the people registered. And to do that, what do they find? What do they find before he starts getting the names down in lists?
The genealogy.
They find a genealogy. And what is the genealogy that they find?
Those that first returned to
Okay, good. Which tells us this is happening after. And we're looking at like 70 years after the first people have returned. So it's a long time. We're talking about, 2-3 generations. So it's a while. It's a genealogy of the people who returned. The first people who returned from the exile. Now, why is that really important? At least for us reading this. What is the writer telling us, at least in his mind, that's really, really important?
We're still in that Davidic line.
Okay, we're in that line is important. That ethnic line is important. It's important to know who's in and who's not. And we've already seen that. When did we see that? A little earlier in Ezra. That this line between who is part of God's people and who isn't. That this is really, and it's not based on your heart. It's based on your family, your background. When did we see that? Earlier in Ezra. Remember at the end of Ezra what they did? The very last few chapters of Ezra.
If they weren't married, people who weren't married within.
If you were married to foreign women, if you were married to somebody that's not on the list, you had to tell them to leave. Which means this ethnic purity is really important. And the writer wants us to appreciate that this is not only important, but it's important to God. This is important to God. And this idea that Judaism is more than just what you believe, but who and what you are, your background. We see that here. Not both in this story, but also in what the writer is telling us. And we see the same thing going into the New Testament, made even stronger with Pharisees, where it becomes more focused on this group that obeys the law. And we still see it. What makes a person a Jew? It's not what you believe, because a Christian can be from a lot of different ethnic backgrounds. But what it means to be a Jew is often that ethnic line. That, and I don't want to call it, because race is really a misnomer. It's that ethnic background. It's your heritage background. It's your history that goes into it. It goes back generations. You don't just become a Jew. You are a Jew. You may believe in Judaism, but that doesn't make you a Jew. And that's what we see here. That's what we see sort of the seed laid. And then once they find this book of genealogies, what the people who returned, what does the writer give us? Right after he said, we found this book of everybody who came back. What does the writer give us? From verse 7 to verse 65. What does he give us? Everybody who came back. Now, remember, we've talked about it before. This guy is writing this on reeds, the skin of reeds, for crying out loud. He's not doing it on a computer. He's doing it on something that's really precious and using an enormous amount of space to list all these people that nobody wants to read. Well, he must have thought it was important, because he would have just said, these are the people who returned, and went on to something else. But he doesn't. He lists the names, which means those names, that family background, must be important to the writer. Not as important to us, because we don't view our relationship with God as ethnic, but they are. That's what they're doing here. And in fact, after listing all of these people, what does the writer give us in 66 and 66 and 67?
They gave the number of the people and.
He gives a final tally.
And that included animals.
And then he includes animals. What has he given us? What do we have now that they didn't have before?
Proof?
Good. Proof of what? Alice, you're exactly right. I'm sorry, I got excited because you're spot on. Proof of what?
They were Jew. They were from Abraham.
Yes. What he's done is he's defined a community. He has defined the children of Abraham right here. Now that becomes really interesting because, and we're going to see it a little bit later, the children of Abraham that he's defining is really the children of God, true, but it becomes the children of Judah. It's not the children of Issachar, who is also a descendant of Abraham. It's the children of Judah. And that's when we start getting Israel and Judah more and more connected. What is Israel? It's the children of Judah and Benjamin. But it's the children of those two tribes, the southern kingdom. It's not those 10 lost tribes up north. It's the southern kingdom. So we get this. So this ethnic component is not the Samaritans. They're not part of this ethnic component. It's the children of Judah. Those are God's people. Okay. Therefore, the Messiah is going to come from where? Going to have to come from Judah, because that's God's people. Now we've got Benjamin wandering around. We've got Levites wandering around. And that's why Luke is going to become really interesting. No spoiler alerts. But Luke is going to use that in a way that nobody else, none of the other evangelists do, which is kind of exciting, those two tribes. Okay, so he's defined the children, what it means to be a child of God. The people who appear on that list. This is, like Schindler's List. This is, Nehemiah's list. These are the children of God. And in response to that, what do the leaders end up doing? As he defines this, what do the leaders do?
Settle them in their town.
Yeah, they start settling in the town and they give all this gold. The rich people are sharing, very generous, and the priests and the Levites are doing their work. Once the community, and this is exciting to me. Once the community is identified and the community is this list, now they can settle into their towns. Now they can start contributing to the temple. Now they can start living as a people because they've been defined as a people. And in fact, now that they've been defined, who are the people? Everything has been wrecked. Now this community is starting to be renewed and restored. What do the people do at the beginning of chapter 8?
They gather together,
Oh.
listen to God's word.
Now they gather together. And it talks about the Watergate. Where is this Watergate? In Washington, D.C. Nixon got into trouble. Where is this Watergate? Jerusalem. Yes, it's in Jerusalem. And what do they want? Now they've gathered together. What do the people who have gathered? Now we don't know, again, we don't notice this now, but a major shift has occurred in Nehemiah. Major shift in how it's written. What do they want, these people who have gathered?
They want the law.
They want the law. And who reappears that we haven't seen in a while? Okay, Ezra reappears. And the last time we saw Ezra was in the book of Ezra doing what? Yeah, he was preaching. What was he preaching? You're right. What was he preaching? Same, I'll tell you, spoiler alert, same sermon I'm going to give on Sunday. Same sermon I'm doing on Sunday. You know, if you're married to 4 women, send her out. You know, same sermon I'm going to do. I've been inspired by it.
Cook the turkey first.
So anyway, but when you think about it, so his focus, we've got this story of community, and the community is really focused on a limited number. Big number, but doesn't include everybody. It's the people on that list. The last time we saw Ezra, he was dealing with the same sort of thing. You know, this purity, idea of purity. The people have an identity, and you can't mix the identity with others. Which, when we look at the story of the kings, that's kind of where it started with the kings. Now, that's the perspective of the writer. I don't think we should read that and say, well, we should be, you know, we got to have some kind of racial purity kind of deal, you know, and if you're not part of I think that's misusing it. That's what he's saying here. That's certainly his perspective. We see a different perspective in the New Testament when Paul says there's no male or female, no Jew or Greek, no rich or poor. I think he's offering a very different perspective on this. But certainly from his perspective, it is the group, the community that's important. So you get the guy who was promoting the community in the end of Ezra. And what does Ezra do? Which is also... when I was reading, I was thinking, geez, this has so much to do with what I'm preaching on Sunday. Because I am preaching about, you know, the importance of getting rid of foreign women, because, you know, they're no good. They're no good. And the other thing is, what does Ezra do? With the people assembled at the Watergate. He reads the law. And, you know, how long does he take?
Till noon.
Yeah, till 6 hours. Yeah, you better bring your lunch on Sunday. Because I've got a lot to say. So I'll be talking a while. And so he reads the law in the presence of the people. And how did the people respond, which tells us about, again, the nature of these people.
They listen to
They listen, which I'm sure will be the way it is on Sunday when I preach for 6 hours. People will be attentive, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, Patty will.
Only those people who can understand.
Yes, well, but we're going to have who to help explain it? I've already appointed some Levites that will go around and explain it if you don't understand. Actually, they're going to have this little stick with a ball at the end to
You mean
knock you.
people sleeping?
Yeah, when they go to sleep. Which on Sunday I had a sleeper. I had a sleeper.
You had talked about a shift though. Is this different too because of the fact that now the people understand? Where before it was just the Levites?
Well, the shift I was talking about, I think that's a good point, because I think you're right. I think and that's a great observation that I hadn't come up with, but I think that's accurate. Yeah, I think right here, the people, this is part of this renewing the community, is the community understands. The law isn't in the possession of the scribes, Ezra, and it's not understood by just the Levites. It becomes something that the people hear. They want it. It becomes part of who they are. It becomes part of their identity. So we've got this ethnic component. You're on this list, but you also have this legal component. This is your law. This applies to you. It doesn't apply to him. Never said, take this law and apply it to the Egyptians. This is your law. This is your law. This applies to you. And that's something else, a strain we're going to see not only in the New Testament but beyond. That this is our law. And in fact, even much later, after in the Middle Ages and right until now, that's why often Jews ended up in ghettos. A lot of times ghettos were by choice, and society wanted that because this was the place where Jewish law was practiced. It wasn't practiced. The Jews didn't want the Italians in Venice or in Rome to practice Jewish law. That was their law. They'll practice it, and the Venetians or the Romans were happy with that because they paid their taxes and kept law and order, so they didn't have to enforce it. It was cheap. They didn't have to spend money. So they were delighted that the Jews were following their law in their little areas. It's sort of like we talk about the danger of Sharia law. Well, the Romans would look at probably Sharia law and say, if a community wants to practice Sharia law, let them do it. As long as they're paying their taxes and not causing a lot of trouble to us, let them do it. If they want to do it in Detroit, that's good. Let them go. Because it's not costing us any money. And that's kind of what's happening here. So that's a great observation. The shift that I was talking about is more in terms of writing style. We move from first person to third. Now we're away from, this isn't Nehemiah written as though Nehemiah is telling his story. This is a story told by a third person observing. And in some ways, it has a whole lot more to do with Ezra, a continuation of Ezra, than what we've seen in Nehemiah. Which may mean that this part of Nehemiah probably belonged with Ezra. But who cares? Doesn't matter. It's just a real shift in how the person is writing it. Okay, so Ezra reads this, the people hear it, they understand, and what do they do when they really understand? What is their posture? They bow down. And now this becomes really interesting too. When they bow down, put their faces to the ground, what are they doing? What would that stance reflect? Because they stand up to hear it, right? And then when they're hearing it, they bow down, put their face to the ground.
Worshiping God.
They're worshiping. And so what is the writer suggesting to us, the reader, about the law? If when the law is read, these very faithful people put their heads to the ground, what is the writer suggesting to us?
They're really, they really understand.
The people really understand it, and when people really understand the law, when they listen to it, what do faithful people do?
Obey it.
What's that?
Obey it.
Well, they do, but what are they doing here?
Worship.
They're worshiping. Now, the reason I mention it is this is going to be an issue in the New Testament. Because one of the things the Apostle Paul is going to say about the Jews is the Jews worship the law like a pagan worships an idol. That's what he will say in Romans 3. That becomes a sign that the Jews are just as sinful as the rest of us, because they end up worshiping the law as an idol. And in a sense, if Paul were going to use texts from the Old Testament to prove that, this is what he turned to. That when they hear the law, they're not just taking notes. Oh yeah, I need to do it. Oh yeah. They're worshiping it as though the law itself has spiritually is sacred. And Paul, because Paul is kind of anti-idolatry, for Paul that's a big deal. That if you're worshiping anything other than the God that stands above all things, then you're probably putting your worship in the wrong place, and it's going to misdirect you. And so this is, but certainly from the writer's perspective, he's saying this is a good thing that they're doing. Paul would say, no, it isn't. What they're doing here is not a good thing to do. Don't worship the law. Obey it. Listen to it. There's some good advice here. Probably you'll live a better life. But don't worship it. Don't worship it. Last night, in one of the meetings, because I had a session meeting last night, not here, but someplace else, a person was just telling a story about a presentation that was done at church, and I would listen to it, and I thought it was interesting. And it was a young man presenting he had done mission work, and he was doing it in front of the church, and evidently on their pulpit, I'm assuming, because that's what they said, I haven't seen their pulpit. Evidently they have a Bible open on the pulpit, which a lot of times pulpits have, Bibles open. And the young man was having trouble because he wouldn't put his phone on the Bible. And his notes were on his phone. And so he was reading from his phone, but he wouldn't put it on the Bible. So he had to have it, he put it someplace else, and it was awkward because he was having to lean over to see it, away. It would have been easy if it had been in front of him, but he wouldn't do that. Paul would say that's kind of dangerous because that means you're worshiping the Bible. You're worshiping the book, not what the book says. You're worshiping the book. And he says, that's kind of dangerous. You got your toes on idolatry when you start doing that. You listen to what it says, but that book is no different than other books. It just contains something that is different. But the book itself isn't. It's just pages. It's just paper. And that's kind of what we're going on here. And as I said before, in the Bible there's a tension. It's not like everything falls neatly into place. There are people that say you should be doing this, and other people say, before you do that, maybe you should be doing this. You got a little tension going on, which means you got to interpret and read and apply it. And different people have different ideas. Anyway, that's what they're doing. They're hearing the law. It's being presented to them. They understand it. Verse 9, we know now we've shifted into third person because in verse 9, who is mentioned?
Ezra.
Nehemiah is mentioned, and Ezra. And Nehemiah is identified as the governor. We hadn't heard that before. In his narrative, he didn't call himself governor. But here he's identified as the governor, which kind of indicates that whoever's writing this is not necessarily the same person who wrote what came before. And Ezra is identified, and the Levites who are teaching the people. And what's the reaction of evidently the reaction of the people?
They were weeping as they listened to the word.
Okay, as they're hearing the word, they're weeping. And why would they be weeping when they hear the law? And by the way, this is all taking place, the writer tells us, at a certain time, right? At the first day of the 7th month. So when this is happening, he's dated it. Now that's going to be important. Why would they be weeping when they hear the law?
Because they hadn't been obeying.
Yes, they haven't been following this law. And what does this because they may have been following it, right? I mean, the people who are hearing it may, but as they think, what do they end up remembering? That their ancestors. Yeah, this is a law that they're worshiping, for crying out loud. And as they hear it, they're crying because in their collective memory, they know that their ancestors haven't followed. This isn't what they followed. And so they're feeling grief. Now, what does Nehemiah, though, say to these people who are crying as they hear this law? What does he tell them? Don't cry. Don't cry and don't weep. In fact, what should they be doing as they remember? Not only hear the law, but remember everything the law has meant to the people. And we're going to get that a little bit later when Ezra prays. What should they be doing?
Celebrate?
They should be celebrating. Now, why should they be celebrating? You know, they end up weeping because they hear this law. They remember God's promises and what he told them to do, and that their ancestors hadn't done it, and they paid the consequences, and things are horrible and terrible and bad. Nehemiah says, you are getting this wrong. Instead, go home and party. Why?
Because God has brought them to where they
Because
are.
God has brought them back. Because they are remembering the God who is with them. And therefore, they certainly shouldn't be crying about that. They shouldn't be crying about the past. They should be celebrating in the present. They should be celebrating right now. And so that's what he challenges them to do. Now, what becomes really interesting is what's happening here. Well, we'll wait on that. Well, what's happening here is there's a celebration that's being established. And in the 7th month in the Jewish calendar, somewhere around the end of September, beginning of October. Now, what else is happening at the end of September, beginning of October? In the year, in a calendar year, what's happening? End of September, beginning of October.
Festival,
Yeah, what kind of festival?
Showers.
Yeah, it will be. You're right. The festival of the booths. What would be happening in all cultures? Yes, harvest festival. This becomes a harvest festival. Every civilization on earth is celebrating, Northern Hemisphere at least, is celebrating in late September, October, because you're bringing in the harvest. It's a harvest festival. And so this is a perfect time to party, right? What they're doing here is really interesting. There's allusions to it way back in Deuteronomy. But right here, we're establishing, and again, I think it's part of establishing a community. We know who belongs in the community. Now they're being given a celebration. And the celebration is going to be centered around the law, and particularly the memories connected with the law. Now, when did the people receive the law? When did the children of Israel receive the law?
When they were in Egypt?
Not in Egypt, but you're close. When they were, yeah, that's right. When they were going from Egypt to the Promised Land. When they were on the Exodus, right? That's when they received the law. What'll happen is this festival of booths, and that's what we do, Sukkot. This festival, that's what it's called, Sukkot. This festival of booths, big celebration, goes on for, guess how many days? 7 days. Goes on for 7 days. Good, perfect number. You celebrate. You also build shacks. You build a shack out of branches and whatever you have around. Why would you build a shack? What are you remembering when you build that shack?
Wilderness.
You're remembering the wilderness, the journey through the wilderness. Instead of living in your comfortable house, you live in a tent, because that's what we lived in as we were going. So it's a celebration associated both with the harvest, which everybody is celebrating, but what they've done is they've connected the harvest, this time of bounty, with the Exodus, and that's what's happening here. That's what's happening here. Now we have it prescribed in Deuteronomy, but Deuteronomy may have come after this. The writing of the final compilation of Deuteronomy may have come much later than this. This is where the writer says it's established. Little boy comes to his father. Why are we celebrating Sukkot? Well, son, let me tell you the story. When our people came home and heard the law and remembered, our journey through the wilderness, Nehemiah told them to celebrate the promises of God. Son, that's why we celebrate Sukkot. That's why we live in booths and shacks and shelters for 7 days. That's why we eat so much. Well, the Egyptians are celebrating a harvest. Yeah, that's right. It's a harvest too. But this, we're remembering the promises of God. So anyway, this is what we ends up happening here. What happens on the second day, according to verse 13?
The leaders and priests sleeping, they met with Ezra.
Mm-hmm. And what do they end up doing as the leaders get together on the second day?
They studied the law.
They study the law, immerse in the memories of this law God gave to the people in the wilderness, and they prescribe the celebration. They outline what the celebration of Sukkot, the festival of booths, of shelters, what it's all about. Even how long you're going to do it. 7 days. Son, why do we do that? Or Dad, why do we do that? Boom, Nehemiah 8. That's why we do it. We're celebrating, remembering the Exodus just like. And something like this hasn't been done since Joshua. When the last time the people of Israel were really united, really focused, when they stood there as the law was read from the mountain, and Joshua says, "Today as to my house, we will follow the Lord." And the people of Israel said, "We will too," as one voice. They're going back. This is this perfect time. They're recapturing what it means to be the community. Now, they have this celebration. 7 days. What's next?
On the 8th day, there was an assembly.
Big assembly. Now, so after they do this celebration, they have an assembly that kind of concludes this festival. When we get into chapter 9, what happens after that?
They confessed, the Israelites confessed their sins.
Got another celebration, right? This isn't the same, because the first one was celebration, which makes sense. You're remembering the promises of God. You're bringing in the harvest. All of that should cause you to celebrate. What starts happening in chapter 9?
They wear sackcloths, have dust in their head.
Okay,
Fasting.
and they start fasting. Now, when they put on sackcloth and dust, what are they doing?
Mourning.
They're mourning. Now, what would they be mourning? So coming out of this celebration of God's promises, they immediately, 2 weeks later, they go into mourning, right? Who is mourning? Who ends up mourning? Who? The Israelites. Because they separate themselves from the foreigners. So this is something that belongs to you. It's not them. This is you. And you end up mourning. And as they mourn, what do they do as they mourn? Because Nehemiah doesn't stand up and say, "Stop crying. You got to celebrate." What do they do as they mourn?
They stood where they were and read from the book of the law.
Okay? And what do they end up doing as a people?
Worshiping God.
Well, they worship God in what sense? Because before they were worshiping God, remembering His promises, celebrating. Right? Don't cry. This isn't the time to cry. You celebrate.
They're confessing.
They're confessing. They're not, "Oh, God's great. Oh, this is wonderful." They're confessing, right? And they confess, and they confess, and they confess. Okay. Why? Why right after celebrating? Why are they now in a period of mourning because of what has happened, what they've done? And it's not... The confession here isn't, and we're going to see this later as Ezra starts to pray, it's not like me confessing my sins. It's us confessing our sins. Yeah. It's us as a community confessing. It's not just me as an individual. I've done bad things. It's we, as a part of a community, have done things we shouldn't have done. So it's a sort of this communal confession, because they're all doing it together, you know.
But it's showing their repentance. for the
Yes,
sins.
absolutely, absolutely. Which tells us, and we'll talk about this a little bit at the end, you know, what is the writer doing? By having this celebration that the Jews still do, Sukkot, the Jews still celebrate Sukkot. You know, that's still part of their faith. Why? What is the writer doing for his audience by writing this? What is he doing for that community, for that people?
Uniting them
He's uniting them around what?
around their faith.
Around their faith, as expressed in these particular celebrations. You know, what makes a Christian distinct as he moves into December? We are about to celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ. Now, does a Jew care about it? Does a Muslim care? Does a Hindu care about the birth of Jesus Christ? No. Should they care? Probably not. But we care, right? That's part of who we are. This is part of our. Now, I'm not talking about evangelism and all that stuff. I'm not. But that's meaningful to us. I saw somebody post online about happy holidays. That there are, 26 religious traditions that celebrate something during this time of year. So when you meet somebody and somebody says to you, happy holidays, that may be them being sensitive because they don't know whether you're a Jew or not. Merry Christmas may be offensive, you know, if you're a Jew. So it may be a sign of compassion, not a sign of an all-powerful state telling us what to do. Or, you know, it just may be they're being sensitive to the fact that we may not be Christian, maybe talking to a non-Christian, because that's something that means something to us. And maybe that's important too, that, you know, when a holiday like that, when something like that becomes secular, the secularization of Christmas, where it no longer has religious significance, it's just not a secular holiday. Maybe that's dangerous for people of faith. Maybe that may be a problem. You know, maybe a greater problem, the secularization of religious holidays. One of the things my dad always was concerned about with Easter, I was having this conversation about a week ago or so. We never had the Easter bunny at Easter, ever, growing up. Now, we did with Maggie, but Dad never did. And the reason we did, we did Santa Claus, so he wasn't completely consistent. But what he told us is, Easter is about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that's our focus. Now, we had Easter baskets, we had Easter eggs, but it wasn't a bunny that brought them. You know, it's about the resurrection. And for some reason, that was important to Dad. I'm not going to muddy the water by having a bunny bring stuff. It's not a fertility time. It is about resurrection, crucifixion and resurrection. It's always dangerous, I think, when we secularize religious holidays, because then they lose meaning. In a generation, they've lost meaning. They don't mean the same thing. You know, just something to file away. I've been thinking about it. So, something to file away. Okay, so we've got this period of mourning. And now, who stands up to pray? To this group that's confessing. Who stands up and starts a prayer?
Levites.
Okay, we got Levites there. What individual? You're right, they're praying, you know, telling people to stand up, glorious name. Who stands up in verse 6 and starts praying? To this crowd that is confessing their sins, who stands up and starts praying? Not a shocker. In verse 6. Of chapter 9.
I don't see a name.
I don't see it.
Oh,
No.
I don't know what to tell you, because I'm looking at it, and evidently I'm looking at something different. Ezra starts a prayer. Ezra starts praying. Now, what somebody read to me to make sure understand. I was working on this and then got a telephone call that was really, really important, and that I had to deal with, and I didn't leave the call until 20 after, 10. So would you mind handing me the Bible you're looking at? Because I'm having to trust things that I may not, probably shouldn't trust. Well, because it's the same place.
Mine just starts into the prayer. I don't
Yeah,
know
starts
who
into the
is
prayer.
leading it.
Wait a minute,
Mine
let's
does
see.
too. Well, it says.
Even in my footnotes, it doesn't say.
Yeah, I'll be darned.
There's a lot to mention.
Because I'm looking at the translation that I use, and it says, "And Ezra said." So
Back at the end of 8, it clearly says that Ezra read, but that was at the end of the last celebration,
Yeah.
not at the
Yeah.
beginning
right.
of this.
Well, but I just take it out of the translation I use, and so for some reason it says that I don't. But it's even if it's Ezra, the fact that Ezra is doing it is not particularly relevant. The prayer is. And what is the prayer? What prayer does he start to make? How does the prayer start?
You are
In verse
the Lord.
6. Okay, focuses on the Lord, right? And what does the prayer, and I'm going to call it Ezra because that's what I got in my notes. What does the one who is praying, what does he say about the Lord?
He made the skies, the heavens, the stars.
Okay, so what is he doing?
Praising.
Praising God. So the prayer starts with praise, but then he shifts, right? And how does he shift in verse 7? What does he start talking about in verse 7?
Abraham.
He starts talking about Abraham. And as he starts talking about Abraham, where does that go? Where does this conversation about Abraham go?
Covenant.
Starts talking about the covenant, right? And then he starts talking about
The descendants.
the descendants. And then he starts talking about
The Exodus.
He starts talking about the Exodus. Now, throughout all of this, what are we saying about God? As he prays, what is he saying about God? Because that's how he started. Talking about the Lord. What is he saying about God? Because he uses second person here. So this is addressed to God. He's just not rambling history. What is he saying in this about God? Okay, God is directing this. God is directing this. You are the one who, you did this. You established a covenant. You saw our distress. You led us. Moreover, when they get into the wilderness, what does God do?
Provides.
Okay, he is providing in the wilderness. So to this point, by the time as we get through verse 15, he's talking about God, right? As God has led this community that's just been identified, right? God has leading them through the wilderness. The focus has been on God, and in particular on God doing what?
Guiding the people.
Guiding, providing, establishing. It's God doing this, right? Now, in verse 16, we got to change. Now, understand, this is a prayer that's being prayed. So it's not, this isn't just a narrative. This is a prayer that's being written for an audience later. How does it change in verse 16?
States the forefathers became arrogant and stiff-necked and did not obey God's commands.
Okay, we've started with God, identifying him, and in the past what he has done, and now we shift to people. And as we shift to the people have not done well. Have not done well, right? So as the prayer is being made, we've moved from this praise to kind of a confession. You know, our ancestors didn't do right in the wilderness. God punished them, right? According to the prayer. Right? No.
He's a forgiving God.
No,
Gracious and
that's
kind.
right. God is a forgiving God. So as the people of Israel in the wilderness, as the children of Israel in the wilderness, as they turned away from God,
He did not deserve it.
He did not desert them in the wilderness. In fact, what did God do for them in the wilderness? What were signs that God didn't abandon His people? He gave them manna in the wilderness. He guided them, you know, with a pillar of fire and cloud, led them through the wilderness. He gave them food to eat. All right? What else did He give? Now, to these stiff-necked people, what else did He give?
Spirit.
Well, He did as the prayer continues.
Gave them kingdoms and nations.
He gave them kingdoms and nations. Now, what are we talking about now when He says or talks about kingdom and nations? What's happening in this prayer?
It's a summary of God from the beginning and
It's
how He led the people.
Yes! Boy, I didn't realize how pertinent, when you ask the question, how do you describe the narrative? This is it. It's God and His people. This is the narrative. And that's the prayer. What the people are doing, or primarily what God is doing for the people and with the people. He's given them all this stuff, right? Kingdoms and nations, the conquest of the land. How did the ancestors respond? Of course, they responded with great praise and appreciation, and they were grateful for everything God did, right? Because that's the way people are. We show gratitude.
And then they did evil
Right?
in their sight.
They did evil in the sight of the Lord. Sounds like a Rudiger family reunion. You know, you got all this stuff, boy, show evil in the sight of the Lord, right? But this is even worse. You know, because they're now committing blasphemies. They're not just stiff-necked. They're doing terrible things. Right? Now, we see a pattern developing. And it's a pattern we saw before in the book of Judges. The same kind of pattern. What pattern is emerging here?
That He gave them a lot, and then they became arrogant, and they went back to sinning.
Yep.
So then He would punish them.
You get
and it was a cycle.
you get this cycle, right? So they are now doing blasphemous things. What does God do?
He warned them to return to His law.
And of course they do.
Nope.
Nope. So what does God end up having to do? Gives them to the hands of the enemy. That's what happened in Judges over and over again. Gives them into the hands of the enemy, right? And what do the people do? Man, this guy, this prayer, he's read Judges. What do the people do after they've been given to the hand of the enemy? Well, they cry for God. You know, same thing. That's right. And what does God do?
In His great mercy, He didn't put an end to them or abandon them.
That's right. He doesn't abandon them. And how does the cycle continue? It continues. You know, the beat goes on. You know, we got this same cycle. And what does God eventually do? What eventually happens? They are going through this pattern, this constant pattern of God showing grace, people sinning, crying out for God, God showing grace, people sinning. What eventually happens? For these people who are hearing it, for us who are reading this narrative, what do we know happened to these people? Ultimately, what happened to these people?
They became slaves? And
Yes,
were they-
yes. How did they become slaves? When did they become slaves?
When they were exiled.
That's it. Eventually, they're going to lose the land. Everything God gave them, the kingdoms that God gave them, they're going to lose. They're going to be taken away. And so the people are lost, right? They're all by themselves in the world, alone in the universe. No. Because what about God?
He delivered.
He delivers them. His mercies have no end. He doesn't forsake his people because he is a gracious and merciful God. So no matter how bad the people were, and they paid consequences for them being bad. God didn't protect them from consequences, but he never ceased to be their God. So what does the one who prays ask in verse 32? What does he ask? Because all of this has just been outlining the narrative that we already know. We know this because we studied it. What does he ask? Now we're getting to petition. What does he ask? As he concludes his prayer, what does he ask?
Is it forgiveness because they're in great distress, so that cycle continues?
Now, do you think the writer wants to suggest that this is just a continuation of the cycle, and that when God does it, the people are going to sin again? Does he want the reader to believe that? Do you think he wants the reader to believe that this is a continuation of the cycle?
Yeah,
See-
because they'll come to a new agreement, a new covenant.
I don't think so because of how it ends. Because at the end of this, after this long prayer, after they've heard the law and after they've heard the prayer, what do the people decide to do?
They make an agreement.
Yeah.
They make an agreement. What's another word for agreement?
Covenant.
They make a covenant. With whom?
God.
They make a covenant with God. Which goes all the way back to the beginning of the prayer, the covenant made to Abraham. So it's like they're doing what?
Resetting.
They're resetting. They're resetting. That all of this has happened, and now we are embarking on a new day. This is a new time. The history shows both God's presence and our tendency to fall away. But we're starting something new here that we don't see repeated. He doesn't say, well, they made covenants and broke them. Covenants and broken. First covenant was with Abraham, and boom, now we got a new covenant. And from this point on, are we going to keep the covenant? Are we going to keep this covenant?
Yes.
You better believe it, according to the writer. That's what the writer wants to convey to his audience. You can keep this covenant. Now, do we keep the covenant? Heck no. Heck no. But the writer, in what he writes, this is a new day. This is a new day. A new beginning. We're after the history. All right. In this section, after rebuilding the wall, reestablishing them as physically, now we've got a people renewed spiritually. We've got a community established that has a new kind of relationship with God, one that goes back to the very beginning. Now, this is what a writer wants his audience. And like I said, as we went through it, there are things in here that when we look at the New Testament, Paul's going to say, and we see with Jesus, maybe I want to pause on that. That's not, we don't relate to God by obeying the law. That's not what Paul's saying. So we don't want to take this, well, if it says it here, we got to do it, and we'll disregard Paul. because all of this is running in tension. But this is certainly what he wants his audience to believe, that this is a renewal through obedience. But I do think we learned some things about worship that we can apply like tomorrow. I mean, what do we learn from this about worship? What do these chapters, as this new community is established as God's people, what do we learn about worship? What might this teach us about worship?
It can unite us.
Okay, worship unites us. Good. What else? What else about worship that we see here?
There's different parts of worship.
Okay, good. We got different parts of, including
Confession.
things like confession, also.
Praise.
Certainly. Don't be crying when you hear the law. Don't be crying. Celebrate. This is good news. You know, what do we learn about prayer? What can we see in the way the prayer is offered? Because I think these are also lessons that the writer is conveying to his people. What do we learn about prayer?
Didn't we have another prayer in Ezra that did the same thing?
We have. We've run into these same kind of prayers several times. What do we learn about prayer?
How important it is.
We learn how important it is. What else do we know?
Because you're seeking God's guidance.
Right.
You're going to Him, which going up to this point showed the different leaders, whether they were good or bad.
Okay.
And whether they asked for God's guidance.
Right?
So you
Good. Yeah, and it starts, where does the prayer start?
Praise.
with
It starts with praise. Praise of God. It starts with praise of God. It doesn't start with God, let me tell you, let me unfold my list. It starts with praise. It just does. And then ends kind of with promise. This is what we're going to do. What about confession? Because there's a lot of confession going on here. What does it tell us about confession?
We have to do that.
Yeah, confession is something really important to do. What else? Because they do it, certainly here. What else? What else might we want to recognize about confession? And again, confession is sort of a churchy term. I sometimes even try to avoid using confession because it's one of those insider. If you're inside, you know what it means. If you're outside, you may be a little confused. If you don't know church language, you may be a little confused.
You have to recognize your shortfalls before you ask for
Sure.
more.
Sure.
Before you ask for forgiveness.
That's certainly what they're doing. They're recognizing their faults, their shortcomings, what they could have done better, and doing it very openly and honestly. What else are they recognizing? Which may be really important with confession. And sometimes this may be one thing that we miss a little bit. When we confess,
We're not obeying the law.
well, not obedience is important.
Recognizing God's power to forgive.
Recognizing God's power. Certainly that's in here, that God forgives. What else is also in here as they confess? One of the things I think sometimes we get a little thought, I know I do, I think we all do, is just because you confessed it doesn't mean you don't face the consequences. And that's what we see. As they confess, God is with them, but they face the consequences of their actions. Even these people are facing the consequences of actions that happened a long time ago, communal actions. We gotta be careful, that we don't assume, well, I've confessed it to God, therefore everything's great. And I'll say it, we're cleansed. And I believe it. Doesn't mean we don't face consequences, And sometimes the consequences are good.
Of the prayer tells us that, they had to face the consequences and basically start over.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear that a lot. Well, how do you know it wasn't confessed? This wasn't confessed. And if it was confessed, then everything should be, you should look at the person and not care, because everything's been forgiven. Well, behavior has consequences. And so maybe part of confession is accepting the consequences for our actions, the willingness to accept that our actions have consequences. Maybe that's part of the confession process. I don't know. I'm just, as I read that, that sure seems to be what I see in this prayer, that the prayer is doing. And of course, this, if I'm right, and I think I am, because I wouldn't take this approach if I thought I was wrong. What does this say about renewal? If this is God renewing, or this people being renewed after a terrible exile, after 70 years, in exile, what does this say about renewal?
Gives you hope
Okay, we get a lot of hope here because renewal is possible.
and restores the faith.
Restores faith, restores relationship, that the covenant can always be reestablished, if we choose to do it. So I think in this is a lot of stuff we can glean, not just from a historical narrative or about a people, but I think it's things that we can apply. Now, like I said, after, any questions about any of this? Now, like I said, we won't meet next week because I'll be eating turkey. Actually, I'll be cooking a bird next week. But we'll finish by looking at the rest of Nehemiah from chapter 11 through chapter 13. So we'll tie up Nehemiah, and we're still talking about sort of this restoration. We've got the people renewed, but we're going to take the last step with this new society that's being developing, or a renewed society that's being developed in the land. Okay? Well, let's have a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this material to look at. Remind us, just remind us that behavior has consequences, but we can always come to you with praise. We can always come to you confessing our faults and our shortcomings, and we can be confident that even though there are times when we may abandon you and pay the consequences for it, you don't abandon us. Help us to recognize that that's the good news. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. Thank you.